It's like Black Sabbath stuff, but just really heavy.
They're from LA?
Yeah.
The rock world is in shock following Guns N' Roses today. Axl Rose, the frontman, broke his decades-long extended quiet over his notorious feud with Nirvana and Kurt Cobain in a shocking interview that followers of both iconic bands were utterly taken aback. The infamously secretive singer, now 63, has addressed at last one of rock's most fierce competition between the nines, and his shock waves have been sent by revelations via the music industry. "I've held this burden for 30 years," Rose disclosed at a tearful sitting that was designed to advertise gnr's next tour, but soon turned into an unexpected terrain that everyone believes they understand occurred between Kurt and me, but that the true story is even more intricate and far worse than everybody else understands. The animosity between Guns and Nirvana and Roses have been doing well. Recorded throughout the years from Axl's earliest awe of Nirvana, even in the Don't Cry video, they are shown wearing their cap. To Cobain's consistent denials of Axl suggests to work together, which leads to in the violent altercation at the MTV Video Music Awards in 1992. However, Rose claims that what we've known up to has just begun to scrape the surface. "People believe that I was merely an egotistical person who was incapable of accepting rejection." Rose stated with obvious emotion that the reality is I was frantically attempting to get in touch with Kurt, since I spotted anything and I saw where he was, and he scared me, headed, and I wanted to assist him in being pulled. Returning from the edge in possibly the most startling disclosure, Rose asserts that his notorious 1992 tirade in Orlando on stage, where he had junkie with a name like Cobain junkie wife, and recommended that they visit jail if their child was born with birth defects, wasn't the savage assault that seemed to be the evening in Orlando that I recently received away from a phone conversation with a common buddy who informed me that Kurt had overdosed once more. Asserts, "I was terrified, I was angry, and yeah, I made the worst possible outburst. More than anything, I regret those words. I have stated throughout my life that I was attempting to jolt him into seeking assistance, but I simply became the antagonist in his tale." The conversation that took place at Rose's Malibu, a long way from the chaotic the setting in which he previously flourished, indicates a man who appears to be troubled by his past, encircled by souvenirs from his 10-year career that included platinum recordings with antique guitars. Rose shows up more reflective than the erratic lead singer who used to make headlines for looking, "I can see how everything works now." Rose plunged further, pointing to an early 1990s framed picture that we were both at the pinnacle of their fame. Battling the spotlight in many ways, I showed up to perform out Kurt, arriving late to performances or leaving the stage performed by withdrawing farther into himself, and as we delve further into addiction, we were both pleading for assistance just in entirely distinct languages. Rose also talked about the MTV video from 1992 and Brawl at the Music Awards, where tensions reached their breaking point between the bands. Point following his taunts from Courtney Love inquiring if he was interested in becoming their child godfather. The evening turned into a sequence of encounters involving Duff, Chris Novoselic, and McKagan almost clashing, and an effort by gnr to members to overturn the trailer for Nirvana. The VMAs that evening were a total, admittedly, calamity arose when Courtney made that remark regarding being the father. Frances Bean didn't think it was just some thoughtless insult, that she was aware I had been attempting to speak with Kurt in private regarding cleaning herself. It seemed as though she was making fun of anything that was actually what matters to me about Rose's thing. that is most shocking is his assert that he had been making efforts to construct a Cobain intervention. Via mutual acquaintances, and I had seen too many talented people in this field. People ruin themselves, Rose explains. I had seen friends pass away from the same. Kurt was obviously being consumed by demons. Yes, I did contact them through persons we both trusted, attempting to establish some sort of people gathering out of sight of the cameras, and the Rose claims that his compassion for Cobain was more than just a rivalry over music, but resulted from his personal battles with mental health and substance misuse. We were more alike than we both desired to acknowledge, Rose thought. But while I could see Kurt, because I had overcome my demons, was being devoured by his, which I knew the agony behind his eyes, like I would observed it in my own reflection. Rose discloses that during Gunn's peak and Rose's triumph, which he was fighting serious mental health conditions that people were mostly undiagnosed during the time. Observed the outbursts, the absences, and the mayhem. However, they failed to notice the panic attacks, the debilitating depression on the evenings I was unable to leave my hotel room due to the idea of being in front of a crowd made me nervous. Rosa admits, when I glanced at Kurt particularly during those final interviews, I observed that comparable fear heightened at 8,000. The interview takes an even longer time. Gloomy turn when Rose talks about what a lot of enthusiasts were unaware that Guns and Duff McKagan, Rose's foundation, was among the final individuals to spoke to Cobain while seated beside him on a Los Angeles flight a few days before to his suicide, to Seattle, April 1994, when Duff informed me of that flight. Regarding his near invitation, Kurt over, as he appeared to Rose paused, clearly struggling, by herself, with feeling that ruined me for years. Continued to wonder, what if I had been on that plane instead? Enough to set aside our pointless conflict and simply have a human-to-human conversation with him. Have changed anything? Rose was joined by McKagan during a segment of the interview revealed his personal memory of that tragic flight for the first time. Kurt and I discussed addiction treatment. McKagan explained how he was curious about how I'd been able to sober up after almost passing away in 1994 due to pancreatic failure. There came a day when we arrived in Seattle. I considered asking him to visit and perhaps carry on the discussion in a more intimate context. I ignored that intuition, and 3 days later on he left, which is something I'll transport. According to Forever Rose, McKagan has never truly recovered from that opportunity. That burden was held by Encounter Duff for years later. The notion that he was among the final individuals to communicate with Kurt that he realized there was a problem, but none of us followed through, have ever truly moved past what occurred. One of the most unexpected interviews, Rose acknowledged at one point that Nirvana's Guns and Rose's musical critique has merit. When we had nothing to do, Kurt said it hurt, because a piece of me questioned whether he was correct. Rose admitted that the music was changing, while we were developing into precisely the famous music artists that we had previously disobeyed against the truth, which I didn't want to hear. In the past, Rose considered his own path. From a street-smart rocker who was hungry to we began as stadium-filling superstars. As the hair metal scenes counterbalanced these honest, unvarnished outsiders' music from the age of Use Your Illusion, we had turned into this enormous private machine. Jets, ludicrous riders' egos control. Kurt pointed that up to us, and rather than listening, I snapped out. The disclosures have provoked strong responses from both bands' fans, with many people are shocked by Rose's recent vulnerability, and others doubts about his reasons for speaking up right now. Dave the drummer, and current frontman of Nirvana of the Foo Fighters, has not yet responded openly on Rose's remarks. According to the interview, Rose has tried to get in touch with Grohl privately countless times throughout the years in search of Dave, and I have had some sort of closure. After a few talks, Rose says nothing striking or profound, but sufficient to establish respect for one another has been a part of his own hell losing Kurt as well as Taylor Hawkins. There has been, and we now have an unsaid understanding. It goes beyond whatsoever occurred in the music historian's 90s. Elena Reynolds inserts the interview. This feud's background has always been presented as a straightforward conflict between glitz, grunge, and metal, but Axl's disclosures demonstrate that it was far more intimate and problem that he appears to be battling sincere apologies and the understanding that in the midst of all the public drama, they're also human. Relationship that could have made a difference if pride hadn't entered the way Reynolds notes that the conflict between Nirvana and Guns N' Roses frequently employed as a symbolic depiction of the evolving nature of the Guard in the early days of rock music. Roses and Guns from the 1990s symbolized the excess of the rock scene of the 1980s, whilst Nirvana embodied the minimalist grunge's anti-establishment philosophy. Clash was an ideal venue for a musical performance. The industry in transition increased as well. Talked about the time in 2016 when Grohl gave him the renowned royal chair that he had been utilized during performances following Rose had shattered his leg, fracturing his foot just before the reunion of Guns N' Roses tour, and proceeded using Grohl's throne. When Dave offered me that, I performed. It seemed more like a peace sacrifice than merely between us, but Kurt would have also recognized the irony that I was actually seated in anything. Dave wasn't lost on me in some strange way. How the throne felt like closure event signaled a public thaw in Rose's relationship with the former participants, in Chris, a former Nirvana-based Novoselic, even endorsed Rose on Twitter. A significant change at the time from their close altercation at the 1992 VMAs. Rose also considered an instance that has gained notoriety in music history when, according to reports, Cobain spat on Elton John's mistakenly playing the piano at the MTV Awards, thinking that story was Rose's. Made me giggle every time. Rose acknowledges with a rare grin, "Kurt looked so perfect." This rebellious action that ultimately Elton informed me I hit the wrong target. Years later, and we both concurred. In an oddly poetic way, this is Kurt attempting to attack what he perceived as excess and pretense, and he ultimately striking one of the most authentic musicians throughout music history. Possibly the most illuminating aspect of the interview occurs when Rose talks about his response to find out about Cobain's passing. "I was in a New York hotel room when someone from our management group contacted the Rose recalls news. My initial response was fury, not shock or sadness. Was upset with him for giving up. I feel guilty for not making a greater effort to break despite all of the chatter between us. It took me years to realize that rage was just sorrow." And Rose in disguise acknowledges that after Cobain's passing, he went even deeper into "I didn't observe his own harmful actions. Take it gently," he continues. "Only the next a number of years were a haze of negative choices, loneliness, and personal challenges in certain respects. Kurt's sadness, death's demise served as a prelude to mine." Absence from public life following the Indeed Use Your Illusion tours is over. Following the end of gnr's mammoth utilize, the world tour of Your Illusion in Rose was more withdrawn in 1993, ultimately spending almost 15 years composing the band's second album, Chinese Democracy, which gained notoriety due to its lengthy production period and enormous budget, I totally withdrew. Rose discusses how my own mental health played a role in that. My health problems are becoming worse, but if I claimed that Kurt had died, I would be lying. Didn't change how I view celebrity, achievement, and the important things in life. Observed the speed at which the world changed, how his suffering turned into amusement, and I no longer desired to be a part of that machine. As the interview went on, Rose discussed how the media's depiction of the disagreement has impacted his connection with Francis being Cobain and love over the "I haven't spoken to Francis in years." Rose acknowledges bluntly that I've seen her at industry gatherings, but I've maintained my keep your distance out of consideration for Courtney. We've had a couple quick discussions regarding the years, nothing significant, but sufficient to demonstrate our differences from one another more people than we did. And Rose discloses in 1992 that he sent a private correspondence to Francis on her 18th birthday. He expressed regret for his remarks in public regarding her parents and apologizing because she didn't have her growing up. "I didn't anticipate a reaction, Father, and I didn't receive any roses," indicating that it wasn't about boosting my self-esteem. It was about recognizing the potential harm my remarks could have brought about. The topic of discussion then turns to how Rose's viewpoint on his competition within your 20s. Cobain has changed as you've aged. And 30s, everything seems to be living, or Rose's death reflects everything perceived now. A slight turns into this enormous treachery. When I look back at age 63, I see two young men who, in their own ways, were both drowning. They were angry because they were unsure of how to otherwise to deal with achievement. Neither of they were ready. In response to the question of whether he believes may have turned out differently if he and Cobain was able to take a seat and speak. To be honest, Rose becomes into after saying, contemplative, "I don't know." After a lengthy pause, Kurt's demons were quite deep, and I was scarcely able to save back then. I could hardly save anyone. Myself. But I consider that alternate timeline occasionally in which we discovered several points of agreement rather than supporting the story in the media on this fantastic rock rival veteran of the music industry Thomas Jensen, who collaborated with both groups throughout the early 1990s, offer more background to Rose's disclosures. What people tend to forget how alone someone is, such as Kurt or Axl, when they attain that degree of notoriety. Jensen says, everyone in their immediate vicinity has an agenda, everyone has a desire, and it becomes almost impossible to trust anyone's intentions in that setting. Contacting a rival that is thought to be of needed to be really vulnerable, something neither man could do at the time. When the interview came to an end, Rose was urged him to tell Cobain what he would say if he could talk to him. I apologize to him today for what Rose said. Without I apologize for the delay in finding a better method to apologize for, making it's more about my pride than his suffering, and I would inform him that the globe has been a less fascinating location without him during the previous 30 years. Rose also